talk about today is the structure of an LD case. And we're going to go over the framework offense model. Okay? And underneath the framework, we're going to talk about the value, and we're going to talk about the value criterion. And underneath offense, we're going to talk about contentions. And then we're going to talk about alternative systems that people use to set cases. Okay, so let's say I make this blanket statement that people in America should not own guns.
Fuck you.
Okay? So if I say that, that is, first off, if we look at it as a claim warrant impact, my claim is that we shouldn't have guns, right? The warrant is non-existent. There is no reason why it's true right now, right? And the impact would be then that some policy ought to be passed to get rid of guns. Okay, now let's use another statement. Let's say I say that the United States federal government should immediately stop using the death penalty as a form of punishment. So now take me through the claim warrant impact there. What did I say? That's the claim. Yeah. Good. Ought to not have the death penalty, right? So what that would mean is that all the people on death row right now would get presumably transitioned into life in prison. Good. So in real life, if you turn on CNN or Fox News or something like that, you hear a ton of these statements, right? You hear, and when you read the newspaper, you talk to adults, or you talk to your fellow classmates and peers, you hear a bunch of people say, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. Now, in debate, especially circuit debate, we are focused on coming up with a non-arbitrary way to decide what we should do. So, in debate, it's not sufficient to say, you should do this because I told you so. We want reasons why we should do something. Now, a necessary analogy for you to understand off the bat is the analogy to biology. If I was to teach you bio, right, and I don't think I'm particularly qualified to do that, but if I was to do that, I'd have to teach you about cells and about hormones and about organs and organ systems and etc., right? And so the word organs has a very specific meaning in the context of biology. Do you agree? Similarly, the word red blood cells has a very specific meaning in the context of biology. Now, that analogy is relevant because in debate, we have decided that the best way to objectively prove something true or false, or to prove that you should do something or you shouldn't do something, is using a bunch of jargon. Our jargon is the value criterion contention model. So you should write that down. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this, yeah? Okay. So, if I say you should do something or you should not do something, another way to phrase that statement is it's a value judgment. Now, let's say that what I care about most in life is being really happy, and happiness in the hedonistic sense. Like, I want to maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. If that's the case, how I decide what we should or should not do will be influenced by my belief in hedonism, right? Now, let's say that instead of being hedonistic, I think it's really important for us to be righteous and to take the correct action, regardless of how painful it may be or how much sacrifice it might necessitate. So, in that world, do I care as much about hedonism?
You would only care about.
Right, or about just taking the action that is most in line with my moral belief system, right? Now, do you see how if my moral belief system is hedonism, then the action in that would be most in line with it would be hedonistic? Cool. So what we need to decide is through what lens are we viewing should, the word should or the word ought. Now, this is called a framework. A framework frames how we look at a problem. So the framework you use will help give you a solution. And if you use a different framework, presumably you could come to a different solution. So under one framework, it may be true that we should not have guns. But underneath a different framework, it may be equally true that we should have guns. Right? And this is actually quite a popular debate. If you look at the frameworks for gun ownership, right, there's a very strong argument to be made about property rights and about privacy. That's why people want guns, right? And so, underneath that argument, the framework that is most important is individual rights. Does that make sense? Hello? Okay, so for those of you following along at home, sorry for that little bit of a distraction. Um, so we were talking about gun rights, right? And we're talking about how the way you frame the conversation about whether people should own guns drastically influences the conclusion you come to. If your most important consideration is societal welfare, arguably you could say that that might be a reason we shouldn't have guns. However, if your most important consideration is individual privacy, it would be pretty hard to prove that people should not have guns, right? So what you deem to be most important will drastically influence what you decide in terms of social policy. Does that make sense? Cool. Another example could be gay marriage, right? In gay marriage, the drastic framing issue, or not the drastic, that's the wrong word, but the key framing issue is whether or not we should be respectful of the institution of marriage or we should be respectful to the individual choice to freedom and privacy, right? And so a lot of people who are pro gay marriage say, you know, as long as it's consensual and the two partners love each other, they should be allowed to get married. And the people who are not pro gay marriage say that it goes against their belief systems because they, you know, believe in some set of systems that indicate that it is not permissible for homosexual couples to marry each other. And so their point is, you know, I'm not saying don't be homosexual. I'm saying don't call yourself married because that's an institution exclusively reserved for a man and a woman. So, do you see how a framing of that problem will drastically influence the conclusion you come to? Yeah? Okay. This is important. And the reason this is important is because in debate, oftentimes the decision of whether you affirm or negate will depend on what the framework is. So, the framework is traditionally composed of two parts. One is the value, and second is the value criterion. Additionally, the other two parts of a framework that I should definitely write down that we need to discuss are the burdens for each debater and relevant definitions. Does that make sense? Cool. So let's start at the value. So, what do you value? You value privacy. What does that mean? Like, you want your own room or something? Okay, what else do you value? So, why are you living at home if you value freedom so much? Okay, cool. So, what else do you value? Okay, how about your family? Do you value your family? How about your friends? How about your mental health? How about like money?
Throw in something weird. How about hamsters?
How about your health? Your physical health? Cool. So basically, the things you value are things that aid in your life substantively, or add substance to your life, right? Now, let's say I had you compare your values. What would you rather have, your mental health or your family? What would you choose?
Mental.
All right, cold-blooded. I like it. So that's goodbye to Jack's family, if it's ever a trade-off between the two. So the one thing about that trade-off is that sucks, right? Like who wants to choose between having their family or being mentally crazy? Nobody. And so that's tough. That's really tough. That's a tough decision. And the point of debate is to help you learn how to make that decision in a rational, coherent, and drawn out manner where you consider all of the relevant factors. Now, hopefully, you're never actually making a decision between your family and your mental health. I really, really hope that never happens. But that's just an example. And I think that example is a good one to illustrate what I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Cool. So now let's talk about value in the sense of debate. In the sense of debate, I have never heard of a case that's like, I value my family. Right? That doesn't really fly in the instance of debate because debate is not personal. It's not like resolved. Should Jack Vogel decide to go crazy or lose his family? That's never a topic, right? So the topic is inherently non-personal. It's about usually some social issue or legal issue or economic issue or international relation issue. And so what's important to debate are things like what we ought to do. We value what we ought to do. So in debate rounds, the resolution always has an operative term. This is really important that you write that down. Operative term. An operative term explains the most important word in that resolution. It explains what the answer hinges on. So in this case, the autonomous medical decisions topic, the resolution hinges on the word ought. Right? So if we decide that ought is a question of morality, then what we value most is what is moral. So then another way to rephrase the resolution would be it is moral to have adolescents make autonomous medical decisions. However, if ought is not a question of morality, but rather a question of legal obligation, then the resolution would now become there is a legal obligation to require adolescents to make their own autonomous medical decisions. Does that make sense? So do you see how what ought refers to can drastically change what the content of the debate will be? Now, in general, most debaters tend to say that ought is a question of morality. There are, however, other definitions of ought and ones that we should be mindful of. We will have that conversation at a later date. Other definitions are definitions like legal obligation, desirability, and probability / logical consequence. Those are all definitions that we definitely need to discuss later. Right now is not the appropriate time. So this is like a funnel. A funnel gets smaller as you go further down the funnel, right? And now we're at the top of the funnel. It's super broad right now. And we're going to get a little bit smaller now. Okay? So let's say we decide that the resolution is a question of morality. It's saying that the judge should vote for the side that is most moral. Okay. Now, if we've decided that, what's the next logical follow-up question? Right, exactly. So another way to phrase what you just said is how do we decide what is moral? So now this is where philosophy comes into play. There are thousands of years worth of literature written answering that very question. How do we decide what is moral? Some people think that what is moral is what leads to the best state of affairs. Some people think that what is moral is what is most in line with universal principles of reasoning. Some people think that what is most moral is what is most in line with virtue. Some people think what is most moral is what is most democratic. Some people think what is most moral is what is most in line with your emotions. Some people think that what is most moral is most in line with what you could reasonably reject or not reasonably reject. Other people think that what is most moral is what we have a contractual obligation to do. And so, do you see how all of those different thoughts, in terms of how you decide what is most moral or not most moral, would influence how we decide the winner of the round? So let's say we decide the most important thing for us in terms of morality is being contractually consistent, i.e., with something like the Constitution or some sort of international contract that we've signed. So let's say we decide that international law and contract dictates that adolescents ought to have their own autonomous decision making. In that world, the affirmative would win, right? However, let's say the negative stands up and says, that's great, but in a world where we grant adolescents autonomous medical decision making, there's going to be nuclear war. Okay? Does that sound far-fetched to you? Good, because it is far-fetched, and it's part of the silliness of debate right now, is that even though it's far-fetched, people think it's a fantastic argument. But we'll learn how to deconstruct that later on. The point I'm making right now, though, is if we have decided that the framework is being contractually consistent, and you are judging the debate round, would you vote for the affirmative or would you vote for the negative? Why? And why do we care about the contractual agreements? Good. Okay, perfect. So even though you voting for the affirmative would lead to nuclear war, you're still going to vote for the aff, right? Okay. Now, do you see how the framework there was super relevant and important? Now, let's say the most important framework was leading to the best state of affairs or the best consequences. Same example, who would you vote for? Why? Wait, I thought that we decided that morality is a question of what leads to the best state of affairs. Right. So best consequences. Why? So another way to phrase that is if you voted for the affirmative, there would be nuclear war. And if you voted for the negative, a lot of people would be butthurt that we have violated international law. Okay, good. So that's a really clear and hopefully easy example that illustrates the importance of framework. Do you have questions at this point? Okay, now the value criterion, Jack, is called the portion of the debate where we decide how we achieve morality. So, is it our contractual obligations, or is it creating the best state of affairs, or is it being most in line with our emotions, etc.? Does that make sense? Cool. So far, we've established the value and the value criterion. Do you see how it's a funnel? The value was really broad, right? It said the thing we care about most in this debate round is not Jack's family or Jack's mental health. We care about morality. Then the value criterion said, that's great, I'm glad we care about morality, but now we need to decide some way to decide what is moral. And the way we go about that process is via maximizing the best state of affairs. Or something like that. Right? So are you sort of following and seeing how that's a funnel? Cool. Exactly. So that's another way to phrase it, is you exclude the other person's impacts. Cool. So it's important now that we understand the funnel and we understand the value and value criterion, to be able to analyze that to the examples we brought up before. I want you to explain to me the value and a potential value criterion on the instance of the death penalty. Okay. Right, but do you see how there could be a disagreement there? Like somebody could say, I agree with your value criterion. However, I think that having the death penalty causes fear in potential criminals, i.e., if I'm about to commit a crime and I know that I could be killed for that crime, as opposed to spend the rest of my life in prison, I would probably be deterred from committing that crime. So, sure, but I'm talking about the value criterion you've chose right now. Do you understand how that does not necessarily flow one way or the other? So that's a really important learning lesson here. That value criterions don't definitionally affirm or negate, right? I so far have given you really biased examples. Like, usually it is not the case that one side clearly leads to nuclear war and the other causes nothing bad. Life is very rarely that straightforward. It's usually much more sort of convoluted. Does that make sense? Cool. So, back to your death penalty example, your value would be morality, your value criterion would be maximizing life. Is that a good way to phrase it? Sure. So, maximizing happiness. Okay. And so then your argument in the offensive part, the contentions, would be, well, in a world with the death penalty, we kill people, and that's not good. And sometimes we potentially kill innocent people. That's also not good, right? And it's super expensive to keep people in death threat. Cool. Are those like pretty solid arguments, you think? Cool. But are you 100% positive you'd win that debate? What do you mean all of them are underneath my framework? Which argument do you think doesn't achieve maximizing happiness? Well, okay, that's a good point. But do you see how if the economic argument is in conjunction with an argument that saving money is crucial to providing services to people and services make people happy, then it could link to your framework? Okay, so let's say that that's included. Do you think you're automatically or you're very likely to win this debate? Okay, I strongly disagree. I think you could win that all of those contentions are true and still very clearly lose the debate. And here's how. Let's say you win all those contentions are true, right? But your opponent wins that even though those contentions are true, you increase or you decrease deterrence. In your world, because you've gotten rid of the death penalty, potential criminals are less scared to commit crime. And so this means in your world, even though less people are dying via the death penalty, more people are now dying via crime. And crime is expensive. It takes money to sort of analyze the case. It takes money to fix the problem. Often people get sued. It creates more court cases. It puts more people in prison, etc. So do you see how, even though you've won your value and you've won your value criterion, you could very legitimately lose this debate? Does that make sense? Cool. So it's really important then, the learning lesson here needs to be frameworks do not win you debate rounds. One more time. Frameworks do not win you debate rounds. One last time. Frameworks do not win you debate rounds. They only set up who the winner will be, or rather, they set up how we decide who the winner will be. They do not decide who the winner will be. So, just because you've won your value and your value criterion does not mean you've won the debate. I hope this is crystal clear because it's very important. Cool. Now, in a real debate round then, what that means is if you read an affirmative with a framework, the negative has the right to concede your framework. If the negative concedes your framework, it does not lose the debate round or come anywhere close to losing the debate round. All it has done is conceded the framing mechanism that the judge will use to decide the winner. Exactly. So the reason we have frameworks in debate is because you're spending a lot of time and money. You're spending a lot of time and money trying to win a debate round, and I imagine it would be quite frustrating if your judge was just like, "Well, I vote for your opponent because I liked his tie better." Right? Would that frustrate you? Okay, cool. So what we want from our judges is objectivity. Agreed? And so the best way to get objectivity is to have a framework debate and then have them evaluate the winner underneath that framework. So when you're winning a debate round, the first thing you need to decide is what is the framework for the debate? The answer to that question will tell you what is most important for you to win in terms of offense. Does that make sense? Okay, it's really, really important that you're following that. A lot of debaters seem to think that if they win the framework, they win the debate. That's not how it works. Yeah, perfect. All right. Now let's deal with the last two parts of the framework. That is the burdens and the contention. Or not the contention, rather. The burdens and the definitions. So the burdens explain what each debater has to do to win the debate. Now, normally, the affirmative's burden is pretty clear, right? Like, normally we think the affirmative needs to show that the resolution is true. Do you agree? Okay. Yeah, generally. In what instances would you disagree? Such as, can you give me an example? Okay, well, couldn't we decide that truth means which world is better? That's the point of the framework, right? The framework explains how we decide who to vote for. So, do you see how that decision, if we decide that what we consider to be true is what makes the world a better place, we vote for the debater who makes the world better? So, I don't think that's necessarily distinct from the AF needs to prove the resolution true. The framework contextualizes what we consider to be true. Yeah? So can you think of AF burdens that would not be to prove the resolution true? Good, good. I'm very, very glad you mentioned that. That is indeed another different burden that the affirmative could have. However, for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to ignore that. Hey, just give me 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So yeah, performance is definitely an alternative model for what the affirmative has to do to win the round. However, we're going to devote entire sessions to performance debate, and that will not be now. We're going to discuss traditional substantive debate, where the point is to prove the resolution true. Make sense? Cool. Now, the affirmative burden is pretty straightforward. If the aff needs to prove the resolution true, logically, the neg probably needs to prove the resolution false, right? However, could it also be possible that the neg needs to prove the affirmative false? So, let's put it this way. If the resolution is false, could the affirmative ever be true? Okay. If the affirmative is false, could the resolution possibly be true? Okay, good. So, do you see how whether or not the neg needs to prove the aff false or the resolution false will drastically decrease or increase its burden? If all the neg needs to do is prove that the aff is not true, it would be easier to win the round as the negative, as opposed to if the neg needs to prove that the resolution is false. If the neg needs to prove that the resolution is false, it would be a lot stronger of a burden than if it just needs to prove the aff is false. So let me give you an example, right? If the negative reads an argument that there is no such thing as autonomy, that we are all slaves to our impulses, right? If the neg reads that argument, it has not proven the resolution false, right? It has not proven that we should not grant adolescents autonomous medical decisions. Right, it's proven that the aff is not true anymore. So even though, like, the relevant example I could give is, like, let's say the affirmative says that the king of France is bald. Now, the negative could stand up and say there is no king of France. But that doesn't change that the king of France is bald, even if there is no king of France. Does that make sense? So, similarly, we can say that adolescents ought to have autonomous medical rights, even if autonomy doesn't exist. So, do you see how explicitly stating what the negative's burden is important? It can drastically influence who wins the round. Okay. The next relevant part and the last relevant part to the framework is definitions. Do you need to define the word the? Good. How about the word medical rights? Okay, why? Good, okay. So, what we need to define is relevant definitions. And we want to be strategic about how we define them. Right? This brings up topicality debate. The affirmative, usually it is thought, has the burden of being topical. By topical, it means it's actually affirming the topic. However, what is the topic is dependent on what the definitions are. So if you define the words in the resolution differently from your opponent, then there's a disagreement about what the topic talks about. And that is the realm of topicality debate, that disagreement. And we will have many, many sessions devoted to topicality debate, but now is not the time. Okay, cool. So relevant definitions, that makes sense? Cool. Now, usually in a framework, how you'll start the round is you'll give your relevant definitions, you explain what each size burden is, you explain what the value is, and then you'll explain the value criterion. So that's the order in which people usually go about this process. The only part of that order that definitely has to be strict is giving the value before the value criterion. You could give your definitions last, or you could give them first. I would recommend giving them first for the sake of clarity. And same with your burdens. Your burdens could be at the beginning of your case or at the end. Make sense? Cool. Now, the last thing we want to talk about today is offense. So, offense usually are called contentions. Now, let's go back to the death penalty example. There were several reasons why we potentially wanted to get rid of the death penalty, right? Each unique reason would be considered a different contention. So, traditionally, each contention is one reason. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, that means that you can have numerous contentions. It is not the case that the debater with the most contentions wins the debate round. It is the case that the debater with the best contention wins the debate round. Does that make sense? So, it doesn't matter how much offense you have, it matters how good your offense is. Solid. Now, the other thing about offense that you have to understand is offense is not in a vacuum. Offense links back to a framework. If the framework is deciding what we have contractually obligated ourselves to, but all the offense is about how voting for your opponent would cause nuclear war, then it would be fair to say none of your offense links. Agreed? So, you need to make sure your offense is relevant to your framework. Similarly, you need to make sure your opponent's offense is relevant to their framework. You also need to make sure that if your opponent says they have offense to your framework, that it's relevant to your framework. Yeah? Good. So, do you see how quantity of offense doesn't necessarily win you rounds? It's the quality of offense. Alright. Now let's say both sides have offense. Back to the standard. The other key thing here to keep in mind is that the value criterion is synonymous with standard. So if both sides have offense back to the standard, how do we decide who wins? Good. So we compare the impacts. This impact comparison usually looks like risk analysis, where we compare the magnitude of the impact versus the probability of the impact. Now, the magnitude of the impact differs based on which framework we're talking about. Right? If we're talking about consequences, we would talk about how the magnitude of it in terms of how bad it was, how many people it affected. If we're talking about contractual obligations, we talk about magnitude in terms of how explicit the wording in the contract was, or something like that. So do you see how what is considered high magnitude differs based on our framing? Cool. And so overall, this is the structure of a debate case. So your first homework assignment is this. I want you to go through the website Circuit Debater. Have you heard of it? Cool. And I want you to analyze 10 different affirmative cases. And you can choose them however you'd like. You can choose whichever affirmative cases you want. And I want you to compile a Word document of these affirmative cases where you write in the Word document who the affirmative case was, who wrote it, what their value was, what their value criterion was. if they had any burden structure analysis, if they had any relevant definitions, and what their one sentence summary of their offense. And each of their offensive arguments. So if they have several offensive arguments, I want one sentence summary for each of those several offensive arguments. When you go through this process, you're going to realize that there are a lot of different ways you can construct a case. You're also probably going to see that there are some questions you have about case construction. Make sense? Cool. So I want you to do that, and then once you do that, that'll be a good conversation to have about the cases, and we can see how strong your understanding of casing is. But understanding casing is important in order to defeat it, right? Now when you respond to a case, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to concede my opponent's framing? If I'm willing to debate underneath the lens that they have decided to say is most important for the debate round, then I just need to prove I have more offense back to their framework than I do. Make sense? Awesome. And the other thing this should tell you is what you should be flowing. You should be flowing the definitions, the burdens, the value criterion. Okay, so the last conversation we said we'd have today is alternative systems that people use to set up cases. So, one are the policy style arguments. This would include plans, counterplans, picks, which are plan inclusive counterplans, and disads. Okay? The next is critiques. This would include links, impacts, alternative, and role of the ballot. The next is theory, right? This would include an interpretation, a violation, standards, and a voter. And the next is burden style NCs. By burden style NCs, or ACs for that matter, it would basically say the burden that is necessary and sufficient for both sides is to prove X. And so if I prove X, I win the round. So this is basically like a syllogism. Does that make sense? Syllogisms are much less popular now than the value criterion model. Now, the classic sort of example of a syllogism is part one of the syllogism is all men are mortal. Write that down. All men are mortal. That's part one. Socrates is a man. That's part two. So, Socrates is mortal. So, presumably that would be read on a resolution that's like, resolved. Socrates was mortal. That would be a pretty silly resolution, right? Because definitionally the affirmative is true. Socrates is dead. But notice how important definitions are there. If we define Socrates as somebody who's alive right now, then it seems like potentially Socrates may be immortal. Make sense? Okay, so that's important. That syllogism slash burden style AC slash NC are much less popular now. But we will discuss them, okay? Okay. So that is the introduction to casing. Do you have any questions? Mm-hmm. As opposed to defensive? What do you mean by clarify? That would be under definitions, right? You would clarify everything you wanted to clarify about the resolution in terms of the burdens and the definitions. Mm-hmm. Well, you'd have to make reasons why your burden structure is more fair than your opponent's. And so what that requires you to do is make theory arguments. And so we will spend a very long time on theory as well, but right now is not the time. Okay. Do you have other questions? Okay.